Globally, the biggest challenge is not poverty. The biggest challenge is inequality. And, all scholars, both in Europe, in the developed countries, and in developing countries, have agreed on that the biggest challenge is inequality. The poor are becoming poorer, the rich are becoming rich. In fact, there is also the narrative of the rise of the stinking rich. That narrative is there, and that narrative is true. There has been a debate by African scholars and activists around this issue of inequality. And also organizations like Oxfam have been championing this issue, putting this issue in the public domain, in the global domain for discussion, that inequality is rising, and that inequality is no longer just a social issue, but it's also a political issue. And for example, Oxfam has pointed out that the issue of global inequalities is as a result of the fact that there is reduced expenditure by governments on social services, that the people, especially the most vulnerable, can't access social services like health, like water, like education. And this is also as a result of the fact that national governments can no longer get resources to be able to provide these services for their people. The growing debate among African scholars and activists is that this narrative and debate should be broadened and deepened to include the realities in Africa, and also to include the issue of social justice. And social justice looks at issues of distribution of wealth, equal access to political, social rights and opportunities, and also look at the factors that are facilitating these social injustices. There is also the need to be able to dig deeper. Why is there social injustice arising from also the economic injustice, which is pertaining at the global level? So the narrative should also interrogate the democratic deficit in the global, at the global level. The narrative should also interrogate the democratic deficit in the global governance. When you look at, for example, issues around in the WTO, there is an exclusion of developed countries, but also the exclusion of issues that are of interest to developing countries. For example, also in the OECD, OECD is very important when it comes to tax policies, which we are following even in the global south. But OECD, most of the African countries are not members of the OECD. So the inequality narrative should also look at the issues of exclusion, in exclusion of governments, exclusion of the people from processes that are determining their lives at national level, at regional level, and also at global level. The African scholars and activists are yet to concretize on this narrative. You find it's some activists are talking about social exclusion, others are talking about economic exclusion. So the inequality narrative hasn't yet been concretized and agreed upon in Africa. And for me, I think this debate is really critical in Africa, how we think about inequality and what needs to be done about it. The question was also about the role of Europe in this debate. For me, I think the role of Europe should be to provide policy space, to leave African scholars, to leave African activists, to be able to really come out with a homegrown Afrocentric narrative around this issue.